All right. Welcome, everybody. I am Sophie Smith, the Assistant Director of York Public Library, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our program this evening, where we are joined by a team of reporters from Maine Public who have been traveling throughout the state exploring how climate change is impacting Maine life. This talk is part of the climate series that York Public Library and the York Climate Action Plan Steering Committee have put together to explore the different facets of climate change in the months leading up to the town spring referendum, where you'll have the chance to approve the town's climate action plan. We've heard from lobstermen, scientists, legislators from York and further afield, all of which you can find out more about at yorkpubliclibrary.org/climate, where we have recordings of previous events and a listing for our final presentation, a talk specifically about the York Climate Action Plan and what it needs from voters in May. We are recording tonight's event, and it will be available on the website within the next few days. By default, everybody is muted or should be muted. I may have adjusted those settings incorrectly. We are going to ask for questions to come through the chat. So as you're listening to the presentation, please feel free to put questions in the chat and we will get to them once all the speakers have had a chance to talk. Okay, so undoubtedly you've heard a story on the radio or read an article that originated as part of the investigation done by this climate-driven project undertaken by Maine Public. County by county, they've been exploring what climate change looks like in our state. And I'm really excited to hear both what they've learned from here in York and further afield. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mark Simpson, the news director for Maine Public, to introduce his team and tell us some more.
Hey, thank you so much, Sophie, and good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for inviting us to talk to you about climate change, especially around York. We really appreciate the invitation from the York Public Library to be part of your series this evening. So I thought I would just introduce our team really quick, and then I'll go down kind of our format for tonight. So I'm Mark Simpson. I'm the news director at Maine Public. So I have the privilege of working with this excellent team of journalists who are all across our state, from our Portland office to our Augusta office, and our Bangor office. And of course, they're going all over the state as we embark on this 16-county journey looking at climate change in Maine. So I'll just start and ask my team to wave. We've got our Deputy News Director, Susan Sharon. Hey, Susan. She's amazing and helps us with our daily coverage. We've got Robbie Feinberg, who was hosting All Things Considered for us just a few moments ago and covers education and a number of different beat areas. Patty Wight, who is with us subbing in for morning edition. So this is late for her. So we're gonna get her in and out so she can get to bed and do morning edition for us tomorrow. Probably getting up at like 3 in the morning to do that. So thank you, Patty, for being here. Charlie Eichacker, who is one of our digital team members and has just done some extensive reporting on solid waste disposal that's moving through the legislature right now. So thanks, Charlie, for being here. And Fred Bever, who many of you probably know. Fred has covered many different environmental issues for us, especially around fisheries, coastal issues, and particularly on energy. So we've got this incredible team with us tonight. So appreciate them being here. And so we're just going to kind of talk about some of the stories we did back in York County, which we started a couple months ago with York County as part of this climate-driven series. We're undertaking this year-long look at climate change in the state of Maine because we know this is really a critical issue of the time, and we felt that the moment was now to really give a hyper-local focus to all of the counties of Maine and try to understand what exactly is happening on the ground, what challenges there are, what solutions there are, and what are issues to be uncovered that maybe haven't gotten the spotlight shined on them. Just a little bit where we've been. We started in York County. We went to Oxford County, Franklin County, and this week is our content drop, if you've been listening on the radio, in Somerset County. So really great stuff there. And of course, you can find all the stories at mainepublic.org. So I thought we would start with Charlie Eichacker, who covered the York Climate Plan, which, as we heard in the introduction, is coming just around the corner for the public to weigh in and decide on. So Charlie, teeing you up here, what did you learn about the York Climate Plan, what they're trying to achieve, what they're doing, and what that timeline looks like?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And very happy to be here. And Jerry, it's good to see you. I spoke with you when I was doing that piece. So, you know, I think big picture, Maine a couple years ago actually passed a big climate action plan that's supposed to guide its efforts responding to climate change. But one part of that plan states that towns should really be focusing on making their own plans for it. And very few towns across the state have actually done that. York happens to be one of them. A lot of the other ones are also sort of low on the coast, and like York, Kittery, Portland. And I think, when I spoke with Jerry and did the piece on the York plan, it was, I think, not quite done yet, but it looks like it is now. And as I recall, you all probably know more about this than me, but I think at the time Jerry said that there is it'll get a vote at the town meeting later this spring. And, I think, so I skimmed the summary of it that's now online. And I think just when comparing it to the state's plan, one of the things that stood out to me is, well, first of all, the targets for cutting your greenhouse gas emissions are a little bit faster, I think. Looks like, I think I saw you're looking to cut them in half by 2030 and totally by 2050. So that stood out. And then I was interested to see that buildings, your report identifies what some of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions are in the town of York, and buildings are the greatest, especially housing, I think. So, just as an example of a local slant on how communities can be responding to this, it looks like there is a pretty sizable section of the plan that's focused on housing and making houses more efficient and making them more resistant to sea level rise and storms, that sort of thing. So that's what caught my attention for the town of York. And again, you all are more the experts. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I wanted to step back and also just provide some other context, partly thanks to my colleague Robbie, who he just did an interview on this week, where while some towns are very forward thinking, including York, in creating these climate plans, there are many other towns, especially in the inland parts of the state, that are not so forward thinking. And so I think one of the challenges for the Mills administration will be trying to build that support and get support to more rural inland communities, so they can be thinking about their own vulnerabilities to climate change, how they can be reducing their emissions and that sort of thing. And
one of the things,
like
one of the things I was thinking about, Charlie, when you think about Maine, you think about emissions, you think there's a lot of people driving to and fro, whether it's for work or for personal reasons, and you're thinking about that emissions thing. So it brings to mind those kind of large employers where you might have kind of a nexus point where people are coming in around shipyards, and you had looked at something around that as well, right?
I had, yeah. So, one of another piece I did for our climate driven series, which was pegged to Oxford County, which is where I live, looked at, again, to step back, a big part of the state's climate plan is cleaning up the energy sector, the electricity sector, and then, increasing access to electric vehicles. And some of my colleagues may talk more about that later, but another part of it is trying to increase public transportation around the state, both in rural areas and urban areas. And I live in a very rural area of Oxford County, and I can attest that the public transit system is not great. I know that because I actually used it to get from my house to work one day, and it took about 3 hours and 4 different buses. So that was a learning experience for me. So as the state's thinking about this, another thing that caught my attention is, they're right now making plans on how to update the state's transportation goals and that sort of thing. And I think they recognize that there is demand for people to use more buses around the state, but Maine's a very car-dependent culture. And so I think a lot of what they're focusing on is how to make buses more easy for people to catch, like, setting up online apps on their phones that people can track buses. And also, another thing they're looking at is working with employers. For example, the Portsmouth Shipyard to let people out at the same time every day, because I think one of the bigger challenges with creating reliable public transit is, people always think, oh, I don't know when I'll go out today. I have to drive my car. But, I think the state's definitely thinking about how to change that and how to work with, people that have a bunch of workers to work on that.
Right. That's interesting. Charlie mentioned this comment about coastal areas, and I think it's true. The thinking that we see is, coastal areas, they get impacted by the weather, they get impacted by temperature, and there's an influx mass of people there. So it's interesting to see municipalities that are thinking in these progressive ways, because in a lot of ways they're sort of bellwethers for some of these issues. That's really interesting. I want to cue up Patty Wight, thinking about that bellwether sense of things. You looked at salt marshes and really did an interesting exploratory piece about why salt marshes are a bellwether and why they're easy to overlook. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so salt marshes, they're really great at storing carbon. They're better than forests. So forests are important, for mitigating climate change, but salt marshes, you could argue, maybe even more so. So I went to the Rachel Carson Wildlife Refuge in York County, and I spoke with some ecologists there, and they talked about how important marshes are, but also that they've been damaged, that they really need to be restored, because going back to the 1600s, farmers they changed they worked the marshes so they could farm in them and control water flow. So they created embankments, and they really changed the structure of marshes. So now, marshes are really good usually at taking in water, filtering out pollutants, and letting it kind of dissipate. But now these embankments are trapping water in the marshes. And one of the biologists I spoke to described it as, when we were looking at this vast marsh that was hundreds of acres, he said it's like dimples on a golf ball. These embankments have created these kind of pools in the marsh, and you can't always see them. And this is why scientists have kind of recently discovered this. But what those pools are doing is they're damaging the marshes, so they aren't as effective at storing carbon. And so when these embankments form and these pools form, not only can the marshes not store carbon as well as they normally do, but they're releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So that was one story. And I would say, if you have an opportunity to go to Rachel Carson, and if you have an opportunity to do a tour and learn more about marshes, they're pretty fascinating.
That's really interesting, because Patty, one of the things we were talking about is, when people talk about carbon sinks, right, the iconic thing is a tree, but your point that the marsh has a huge role to play there is so interesting. But segueing from trees into the woods, where I'm going. This you also discovered that ticks as a vector of disease are increasing in places like York County. And this was a story that actually got picked up nationally. And it's just fascinating because, unless you're outdoors, engaged in those activities, you hear anecdotally how bad the situation is, but you really got up close and personal with some hunters and some deer that they were hit pretty hard, I guess.
Yeah, so I hooked up with a vector ecologist who's tracking ticks. And living in York County, I'm sure you're all aware of just how problematic ticks are. So we know that, but vector ecologists are really trying to track where the populations are concentrated and where they're moving. And, the ticks are moving north in Maine. Climate change is actually creating a very hospitable environment for ticks, because we're getting warmer winters and the temperature and more moist weather, and that's, ticks love that. So ticks are moving north, and further south, what climate change means is that we're probably going to see new species of ticks come into the state. And unfortunately, York County, may be the first county to see something like that. So these vector ecologists, not only are they tracking the ticks that are here, they're trying to see what new species might come. So one that they're really watching out for is the Lone Star tick. It's been working its way up from Virginia, and ecologists are saying it's not a matter of, if it will come here, it's when. So they want to find it and try to eradicate it before really takes hold. And then something else that they're watching out for are mosquitoes. And the ecologist that I was talking to said that he's actually more concerned about mosquitoes because, again, the climate change is creating great weather conditions for mosquitoes, and they carry triple E. And, there's some concern that we're going to see more of that. And that's a much more, ticks carry a lot of serious diseases, but triple E, Eastern equine encephalitis, I mean, it's potentially fatal. So one of the takeaways from the scientists that I spoke to was that, not only do we need to track and sort of try to identify when things are changing, new species, or are we getting more mosquitoes and, seeing triple E, but also how important it is for homeowners to take action to try to prevent making, your own landscape a nice place for ticks and mosquitoes. So removing standing water, getting rid of things like invasive species that ticks really like Japanese barberry and bittersweet. So I thought that was something that was sort of good for us all to sort of remember.
It is interesting, and for anybody that's going outside, certainly something to keep mindful of. I'm going to call up Fred Bever here, and Fred, you did a real big look over at the shipyard and around Kittery, Portsmouth area. Talk about climate change and the shipyard and what the thinking is, I guess, for the long term, and what that means around defense planning in the reporting that you discovered.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for being here and putting this forward. So you've probably heard that the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. And a lot of my reporting is around what kind of change that creates in the ecosystem itself and what it does for the fisheries, around the fisheries as well. But it's something that don't talk about so much as it also puts our coast sort of at the forefront of sea level rise. Because the water is warming and it expands. Also coming up, we're going to be going through a lunar cycle over the next 10 years that actually increases sea level rise even more than some of the models account for. And there'll be some reporting on that later. So at the shipyard, of course, okay, it's submarines. They're okay when they get wet, but not when they're in dry dock. And so there's a lot of infrastructure there that needs to stay dry. And when I reported on the shipyard there, what interested me the most was watching the turn in thinking in the military from maybe 10 years ago, or even not that long ago, when climate change wasn't really integrated into its planning, to about 5 or 6 years ago, really starting to see budget planning include investments that help with resiliency against climate change. So that's happening at the yard, particularly with a recent round of infrastructure upgrades that they've been doing. And the way it manifests is they're just getting underway with, I think it's about a $200 million project. And they are going to, the commandant, when I did the story, and actually I'm not sure if he still is, Dan Etlick, said that about 10% of the budget goes to resilience. And it's basically making everything taller, raising abutments 3 to 6 feet, raising curbs 3 to 6 feet, raising streets 3 to 6 feet, which is about as much sea level rise as predicted over the next 100 years. So everything's being raised up as they do their ordinary refurbishment. And there's another side to it as well, which is there's many more volatile storms. And as you guys in York County know well, CMP has some trouble contending with that. It has some of the worst circuits in the state in that regard. And so you lose power a lot. It's been an issue for the shipyard too. And it's become a more frequent issue over the last decade or so. And so they have worked now to make themselves more independent electrically from the mainland. And they've just recently installed a big gas generator that provides both electricity and steam power for the facility. And they've also got, I think it's a 3 megawatt Tesla battery, a grid scale Tesla battery. And they have their own little microgrid system so they can become completely independent from the mainland. And so for now, for the shipyard, climate change readiness and military readiness are much closer aligned than they used to be in the past. It's very much part of their thinking there.
You know, when you talk, Fred, about stuff being raised, elevated to combat sea level, it makes me think of, you know, Miami, I know, is undertaking a huge plan to elevate itself. So it's interesting to see in different parts of the country what the approach is. You also looked, Fred, at solar and kind of this big land rush push to get solar installations put on land that's open and available, and that's having an interesting intersection in the agriculture sector. Tell us about that.
Well, it is true that many farm properties have been put to use as now as sites for solar facilities. It's not. I visited one in Acton, which was a former farm field. I don't think it was very active until the solar developers came. But it was one of the first ones to come online since basically when Paul LePage left government and Janet Mills came in. The former governor had really kind of kept a lid on solar developments, both at the residential scale and at larger scales. The legislature and Governor Mills really worked to expand smaller residential, mid-scale, and the biggest projects, just really kind of supercharged solar. And they got it. They expanded what's known as net energy billing or net energy credits that provide you a credit on your bills when you make more solar electricity than you use, and you put that on the grid. They expanded it pretty far, and there's been some problems along the way. CMP and Versant in Northern Maine weren't quite really ramped up for this rush of projects being come in. And so there are many people who have signed up for some of these companies, many of them from out of state, that have invested in these 4 or 5 megawatt solar projects, serve 1,000 people, 10,000 people. And they haven't been able to get the interconnections they need to the grid going fast enough, because there's a lot of studying, a lot of planning that needs to go into effect. And both CMP and regional planners weren't quite up to speed on that. Maybe understandably. There's been some battles between the developers and them. So there's a lot in the queue. There's 600 projects waiting to get built. There's where we had 17 megawatts going in a year until about 2019. In 2020, we saw 75. 2021, we saw, I think, 165 megawatts. We're now well over 300 megawatts. So it's coming, and it's going to continue to be sprouting up all over the state.
Great. Thanks, Fred.
There is a cost, though. I just would like to add that the regulators, the Public Utilities Commission, and Bill Harwood, the public advocate, says this keeps them up at night. There's a big cost that everyone pays for this solar, because when CMP and Versant lose those revenues that they're giving back in credits, everybody else has to help make up to keep the wires going. And they're predicting something around $97 million a year for all of us ratepayers to absorb to handle the lost revenues from the solar.
Robbie, you also looked at this solar farm issue. I mean, literally, it's a solar farm that's being converted, and a little bit in an interesting tangent here to Fred. I wonder what can you add for us about that?
Yeah, well, Fred's talking a lot about those, like those kind of 5 megawatt, 6 megawatt systems, and the farm that I visited, if I remember, I think it's upwards, I think, of 150 megawatts. It's this giant solar farm in Farmington, and it was just massive, and it was, I think, 300,000 panels. It's just really wild. But kind of what was amazing to see is it kind of was this crux or symbol of what's going on in terms of kind of solar and farmland right now, where there are, as Fred mentioned, there are so many developers looking to develop solar farms on as much land as possible. Farms are this great option because they have, lots of sun that's going to them. They have very few trees. And so this farm that I looked at, he basically did it almost as a way to keep his farm alive because he had lost a milk contract, and the solar basically was able to make enough money to hold on to the farm. So for him, it's a good thing, but for a lot of other farms, they're really worried about it. They're worried about losing working farmland and what that could mean for a state where we're already losing a lot of farmland. So there's currently this kind of this tension. I wouldn't say conflict necessarily at this point, but definitely kind of a tension about what this could look like going forward. Legislators actually just passed a bill to try to get a hold of this. The Maine Department of Agriculture is really concerned because they don't know, they really have no idea what farms are being used. They have no idea about kind of any of this right now. So they just passed a bill to try to kind of get a hold of this. So I think the hope is that they can basically put the development in places that are less working farmland. So even thinking of like a farm that may be affected by PFAS, which is, people are talking about so much, maybe solar panels can go there, maybe to a landfill, maybe to just a part of the farm that isn't used all that much. So that's the hope, but there's still this kind of big question right now about it.
Something that I think resonates with just about everybody who's got a house in Maine too. You looked at energy efficiency and things that people are doing. I was thinking about it. Just before this Zoom, I went to go open my front door and I felt some air coming through part of it. I went, oh boy. You were looking at this energy efficiency question and sort of things that people can do. What did you learn?
Yeah, so I mean, I knew that it was an issue, obviously, if you've ever been in any old building in Maine, which it's pretty impossible not to have been in. But what I found, the numbers are kind of staggering. One expert, he told me, I think 96% of the houses in Maine were built before there was a statewide energy code at all, and so obviously, so you wind up with all of these very drafty old homes. And the state has kind of taken this on in some ways when it comes to climate planning, where they've basically said, buildings are such a big part of our carbon emissions when we look at just how much heating oil we're using and natural gas, all of those sorts of things that we're using, all the time. So they wanted to focus on really plugging up homes and getting them as energy efficient as possible. What I kind of was looking at was kind of the feasibility of doing that when you look at things like costs, where the state does have a pretty good weatherization program. That the first home weatherization program in the country actually was here in Maine, but it's very limited and it's for very certain, it's only a few thousand people a year, even if that, are able to get to use this. And so it leaves, thousands and thousands of homes where how are you going to actually fix them up? So I got to visit there's this organization called Window Dressers, which basically they create these window inserts that are made of wood and this kind of polymer film that really does like a pretty amazing job of firming up windows. I was able to see it with folks, and you actually kind of have to go to a community build where you build your own window inserts, but they wind up being really affordable. They're they're about $20 to $40 each, depending on what you want to get. So that's one way of kind of trying to approach this problem. But it's still really staggering how much we need to do at the same time. When you look at, I mean, you go through the state climate data on this, and it's hundreds of thousands of homes. So I think that's still a big question that people have of how are we going to do this?
And as we know anecdotally from reporting, there's not a lot of contractors out there to meet the demand to do all this. So that's another fascinating aspect of this. All right, I know we've got some people are interested in comments and questions. We've just got one more person, and we're going to take those. We're going to open up the chat here to take your comments. But Susan, Sharon, just pivoting back to the coast and thinking about conservation land, you were telling about this interesting link up that the Biden administration is actually trying to put together to conserve more land around the coast. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, not just around the coast, but it's the 30 by 30 plan, which means to conserve 30% of land and 30% of freshwater and ocean by the year 2030. It sounds like an incredibly daunting statistic and goal. But in Maine, what I learned, not so much about the ocean, that's a whole nother question, but around the land and land conservation in Maine, we're doing pretty well. There's about 4 million acres in Maine conserved so far. That's public land, federal and state, but also land that has been conserved by private organizations. 4 million so far, and if we're to get to 30% by 2030, that's another 2 million acres, which is, I think in my notes, I think it's like twice the size of Rhode Island we would have to get to. But what's pretty cool is that a lot of land trusts and conservation groups are really highly motivated. They've seen a lot of interest since the pandemic and people wanting to get outdoors. And so also that's translating to people wanting to protect the lands they love. And so there's been a lot of interest and a lot of actually effort in Western Maine that we've kind of looked at with this project so far, most recently with more projects in the works supposedly around other parts of the state.
Great, Susan. So we just wanted to give an overview of some of the things that we covered in our York County coverage and some surrounding areas as well that had these universal themes. But I'm happy to take questions. If you're able to put them in the chat, that's really helpful just to keep track. I think, Sophie, did we have someone who wanted to speak as well? Is that Jerry?
Yeah, I'm going to let Jerry Runty unmute so that he can share the specifics of the climate action plan here in York as it might relate to the evolution of Charlie's comments.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, hi, Charlie, good to see you in person here. Just a couple of observations. One of the things that we've learned in this process is, I think a takeaway is one size doesn't fit all. If you look at York, for example, and you have the preponderance of emissions in the building stock, but still a substantial amount from transportation. What it ultimately takes is, number one, a detailed vulnerability assessment of there are things that are happening now that we all pretty much understand are going to continue to happen and likely get worse. And we need to know where those emissions are coming from that are aggravating the problem. And so for us, it's buildings mostly and transportation in terms of emissions. But boy, it's really seacoast that impacts the overall fiscal and financial impacts of what's going to happen regardless. Hopefully we can slow it, but regardless of what happens in the future. In other places, that might be a very different equation. When you look at forests, one of the things that popped out of this analysis was, I'm trying to remember the number off the top of my head, but the carbon sequestration of marshland is many multiples the equivalent per acre take up of a forest. And so the importance of those marshlands comes into play, but they also have a factor in terms of resilience to sea level rise because they absorb water and so on and so forth. So there's a dual role there. But I think if you move inland, the elements of the equation changes, but it's still very much, where do we reduce emissions and where are the biggest vulnerabilities and what can we do about it? You have health effects, you have vectors coming in, you have change in species, you have impacts on forests, you have land conservation. All of the factors are common. It's the relative emphasis that really changes depending on where you are.
Yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, Jerry, I guess one of the other things I noticed in the report, the sort of final report now, is looks like there's a big section on equity, I think. And I guess I'm wondering how you see the role of kind of equitably rolling out this plan and making sure you know, people, the more vulnerable people in your town are kind of getting considered as part of it?
Well, the approach that was taken here was to keep that as kind of a primary ethic in terms of what the ultimate recommendations were. But from a process standpoint, individual working groups looked at different topics and came up with recommendations. But there was then sort of an oversight view from a different group of people who looked at it from the perspective of what are the equity impacts, and there's lots of them. There's if you look at lower income groups, they're not in a position to go make discretionary investments in things like energy efficiency. So how do we enable them to have a role? How do we help them financially to have a role? You know, from the state's perspective, a lot of what they're up to now has kind of a caveat, and you know, a very strong element has to go to particularly targeted communities. Another community that is a factor for us is York. The town of York is the oldest community median age in the state, and the state is the oldest median age in the country. And so there's a very large, if you look at the demographics, there's a very large elderly population. The elderly population is susceptible to issues with transportation. They're susceptible to issues with increasing temperatures and health effects. So what are the public health ramifications for many of these different groups? And so we tried to incorporate that ethic into wherever it was feasible in, you know, the list of recommended actions that the plan could take.
It touches on so many different things, Jerry, as you just articulated. It's a massive challenge, issue, and topic, and that's one of the reasons that we're giving it more than a year to look at this. I just want to call out a little something that's going on in the chat. I don't know if everyone is seeing this, but, and I don't know, Susan, if you want to sort of summarize this, but we got a great question here about sea level rise over the next 100 years that we often hear about that, and what do we know to expect in the more immediate term, like over the next 20 years? And I don't know, Susan, do you want to just sort of highlight what you were chatting about there?
Yeah, well, I'm sure a lot of people on the Zoom here know about this, but there's a great report. I think it came out last summer from the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, and it's called Tides, Taxes, and New Tactics. And it's about sea level rise and what to expect in Kennebunk, Wells, and York. And what it says is that under the modest trajectory for greenhouse gas emissions, expect about a 1.6 foot of sea level rise by 2050. And that's about 3,500 parcels worth over $645 million at risk by 2050. But what we are knowing, and I think Fred is pointing this out too, is that right now it looks like we're heading not in a great direction on this planet above those modest greenhouse gas emissions, so that in the state climate action plan, for example, Maine won't wait. The prediction or the suggestion is that we plan for a 3-foot sea level rise by 2050 and 8 feet by 2100.
Wow.
Yeah,
that has serious ramifications. Thanks for talking through that. And there is a lot of information there. We've got a couple links in the chat here as well, if people are looking for more data on that. A question for Patty Wight here. This from Sophie. Thanks, Patty. She asks, is there an intersection between ticks and salt marshes, or if I just had bad luck at the Rachel Carson Preserve? How does this change as climate changes?
I mean, salt marshes weren't pointed out to me as like a particular place where, that are especially where we're going to find ticks even more than other places. But I think, they are moist environments. So, and if you're in Rachel Carson as York County, and that's where a lot of ticks are, unfortunately. So I don't really have a good answer for you other than I guess it's not surprising that they're there, but I think this is also why ecologists are saying, you know, at the state level and the municipal level and at the individual level, everyone needs to try to make an effort to, you know, make environments as least hospitable to ticks as possible.
Not trying to draw out the gross factor, but Patty, do you remember when you had the hunters and the deer, how many ticks did they say they were like finding on the deer?
You know, boy, I mean, dozens. And then some of the hunters came in and said, you know, that the ticks, that the deers they brought in, there were way more, you know, even hundreds, but they kind of fall off and after they've taken the deer.
Hundreds.
So yeah, it's pretty, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. Are there other questions anyone has in the chat or a comment anyone wants to ask to the group here? I'd be happy to talk about other things that are coming up in our climate series.
One thing I thought we might want to mention, Mark, is just about the electric car that we're using as part of the project, because people might have questions about that. We're new to it, but still.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I meant to mention this. We, as part of this series, we got an electric car, both to try to reduce our own footprint as we report the series over the course of a year, but also to understand what the infrastructure looks like in different parts of the state to try to use it, because we know there's so much interest about this. And Patty, actually, that's a great cue up for you. You've been our like electric car guru along with Susan, and it's Pearl. We've nicknamed the car Pearl. I think that's probably because of the paint job, right?
Yeah, pearly white, you know, very convenient for a nickname. You know, so right now there are about 6,000, a little under 6,000 electric vehicles on the road in Maine. And the goal is to get to 219,000 by the end of the decade. So there's a lot of growing to do. And there's some concerns about getting there in terms of just supply chain issues. That's kind of thrown a wrench, I would say, in that goal. And then also another issue is just the charging infrastructure. So we have about 500 chargers in the state, and that sounds like a lot, but we really need a lot more. And we are going to be getting more because Maine's getting $19 million from the Biden administration as part of an EV charging plan. And that's going to help install fast chargers along kind of major roadways. But we've taken Pearl out and we've had some learning, I would say electric cars are easier than you think. And personally, I have a hybrid, and even just going to that, I've thought I will never buy a gas car again. But anyway, we have had some pitfalls with traveling long distances in cold weather. I don't know if Susan wants to talk about it. I mean, you do have to, it's just a slight change in thinking about traveling. And I think once you do it, it's not difficult, but you do have to make that shift to think about, in a car, a gas car, you're going to find a gas station somewhere, they're easy to find. But with the electric vehicle, you really need to know where are the chargers around where you're going and where might you need to stop to charge up so you don't get stuck somewhere.
And you shouldn't be a beginner such as I was when you're going to Rangeley and then there's a roadblock and you're not sure if you can make it to Kingfield and return, so then you have to turn around. But anyway, Patty's story about that, about rural infrastructure is coming up tomorrow, actually, tomorrow afternoon and evening, and she'll be talking more about that.
And I was going to say, Fred, you have talked often with the news team about this sort of electrification challenge that the state is facing. I don't know if you want to chime in on that and how it relates to the electric car conundrum. Oh, you're just under mute there for a sec, Fred.
There we go. Yes, it's a challenge that's only beginning to be thought about, which is, okay, if you've got, how many did you say, Patty? 265,000 electric vehicles on the road?
219,000.
219,000. How are you going to supply them all with electricity all overnight from everybody's houses? And what is that going to cost? And so there's a stakeholder group right now trying to figure out how to price electricity for charging your cars. And so you've got environmentalists, utility people, car people, all trying to sort of put their heads together and figure out, well, we want to, the state policy is incentivize beneficial electrification, which means EVs. How can we price it so that it works for everyone? So it's not, doesn't become more expensive to power your car with electricity than it is by gas. So that we're just at the early stages of that. So in addition to the physical infrastructure, there's the policy infrastructure that we need, the electricity rates that will encourage us to charge our vehicles at a time when it's most beneficial for everyone else and for the grid. Someone asked on the chat about the utilities saying, well, we're getting all of this renewable energy that comes from distributed sources, like a solar plant here, a solar plant there, a windmill over there, and the utilities complain that this grid isn't built for that. And they do. The CEO of CMP said to me, when I was working on one of these stories, it's like trying to bring on 2 Maine Yankees, but in 500 different places. That's the equivalent of how much solar power is now in the queue. But it can be done. It's complicated, it's difficult, it's expensive, and how you decide who pays for those investments is a really big part of it. Right now, these new solar developers, they're making enough money that they're willing to put up millions of dollars to make these interconnections happen safely. But that's part of why it's been going slowly, is because it's not quite rocket science, but it is complicated and difficult to engineer.
Thanks, Fred. And we also, Patty, ticks are a hot item. So we have a question in the chat. Just there are some companies that say they're offering kind of a tick repellent treatment, a natural oil that would be put in your yard to make your property more inhospitable to ticks. Any thoughts on that?
I unfortunately, I don't know. I'd have to know the oil. I'm not really sure about what are the most effective ways to treat ticks. So I'm not really qualified to answer that question. I would just say, you could call or get in touch with the vector-borne disease laboratory at Maine Medical Center's Research Institute. They would probably have some answers to that question and other tips on just what to do on your property.
Right, and you had mentioned some of those things too, right? There could be plants you might
Japanese barberry is a big one. I guess ticks really love it, and bittersweet.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, I've read some interesting things about the height you should mow your grass to maybe discourage ticks. But they are out there. I know I've found a couple ticks on me, just not in a wooded area, just walking in my yard. I found a tick walking on my shoe. I went, whoa, they're just everywhere. And I'm not even in York County. But let's see. Also, I want to point out here, Jerry in the chat says the York climate plan can be downloaded at yorkcap.net. If you click on plan materials there, it's now available for people that are looking for that. Other questions in the chat? Let's see. Oh, and Sophie's just putting a reminder in the chat too. There was a presentation just ahead of us about ticks. So go to yorkcountypubliclibrary.org/climate for that recording if you want to go for the deep dive on ticks. if you haven't sucked all that you can out of this topic yet. What else? Susan, talk a little bit. You've been thinking about sea level rise and sort of the way that this Biden plan looks at ocean conservation and forest conservation. Can you talk a little bit more about that intersection and what it means around climate and why it's so crucial?
Well, yeah, I mean, for that, I touched on the land one. I don't know a lot about the ocean one. I think that's more of the daunting. It's daunting in many places anyway, but the ocean freshwater one is confusing because people don't really know how. You can't really measure it, and it's going to be tougher. But the reason that it's important, this plan is getting attention, is just because you know, it's an answer to climate warming in one regard. It's one part of the equation, but also for biodiversity and protecting animals from extinction. That's the other reason. And they need, you know, these large landscapes to move across, species do. So that's why, you know, instead of just like fragmented parcels being conserved, it's better to think in big terms, large landscape size conservation, and true for the ocean as well.
I'm thinking also, Robbie, about your story, how you touched on heat pumps a little bit. We've been getting some warmer days here, and in my own house, we're wondering if we should make the switch from heat to AC because we're not well insulated, and so it gets hot upstairs, but it's cold in the morning. I tell my wife we can't have one heat pump running heat and one heat pump running cold. That just sounds like climate madness in the house. But talk to us about what you learned about heat pumps and the role that they might play going ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like folks like Fred have been reporting on all of these things with heat pumps for years. But in terms of when it comes to energy efficiency, that really intersects with heat pumps a lot. I mean, obviously we see in the state plan, they talk about the huge goals for heat pumps. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands over the next few years. One of the important parts of that, though, is if you want to get a heat pump, you really do need to have a place that is well insulated, as you just talked about, Mark, and what you're running into at your place. And I mean, I even at the event that I went to, where they were doing the kind of insulation of the windows, it was done by this group out of Norway, Maine. That was they basically had to do a full insulation of this old building in order to get their heat pump to become their full source. But it speaks to the need for, you know, insulation and the need that this is all kind of interconnected, that the only way that you can really tackle all of these things is if you are dealing with efficiency, is if you are dealing with electrification, all of these pieces. And it also, I think one of the things we've touched on, the equity piece, but it also really touches on inequality and inequity that we see, where you look at the new houses that are kind of net zero or those sorts of things. Obviously, it's the people, you know, who have a lot of money and can afford them. But then when you look at folks who are low income, I think the state says that they average, I think it's 20% of their bill winds up going to energy. So I think the hope is with a lot of this stuff is that it can help to take on some of these inequities as well. Is that, okay, if you tackle climate change, it also can hopefully bring down people's energy bills as well when they get a heat pump, when they do that efficiency, and help to kind of even out some of those things.
I think it's really interesting. We're seeing, you know, just we know anecdotally there's more and more demand for it. And if any of our audience members have tried to call and schedule for a heat pump installation or even a review before they might price you out for a heat pump, you know that there's a long waiting list, oftentimes at months out to do that. So it's definitely something that's heavy in demand. Well, I know we're getting near the top of the hour and probably the end of our time. So I'll make one more pitch out for questions from the audience or comments if people have any questions or comment on climate change, and I'll look for them in the chat, or if you want to unmute or anything like that, I think Sophie will see that. But I thought I'd also take this moment to talk a little bit about climate coverage for Maine public and where we think it's headed. One thing to highlight is, there's a good question here from Jerry. What have we found in all the other counties? You know, it's interesting, and maybe Susan, I don't know if you want to talk about this a little bit, but we're sort of, I feel like we're moving sort of from the south, heading up a little bit seasonally, following the weather patterns, trying to think like what are the most active, what are the conditions that most activate some of these different counties during different seasons. So we're sort of looking at the places that have a winter sports focus and a winter economy, and we're going to be moving into places that are more coastal and more wooded as this next round of series stuff progresses. But Susan, I'll tee it up to you as our climate guru to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, right now this week, as I think you mentioned, we're in Somerset County, and after that, we're going to be in Piscataquis County, which includes Moosehead Lake. And I think one of the things Robbie's going to be looking at is ice out there on the lake. It's typically in the first week of May. I'm not sure what's happening there right now, but Robbie will be looking at that. And then after Piscataquis, Penobscot and Aroostook, and then we'll start coming back down around the coast and have probably more coastal stories from those counties as we head back down toward Cumberland. Will be the last one we hit when we're finally done. But that's the kind of the order of things. And if you all have ideas for us, stories you'd like to hear, stories you think that are undercovered when it comes to climate, we're happy to hear from you. And you can email us. I'm not sure what the best way to do it is. Tell me more, Mark.
Yeah, I would say the tell me more at mainepublic.org.
Tell me more at mainepublic.org for any kind of feedback you want to give us about the project or stories that are on your mind, or even if you've got specific things in a specific county, or if you want us to visit York again when we're done, and you've got another idea for stuff for us to cover.
That would be the donut, as they say in
Yes.
public radio, when you start somewhere and then you go on your journey and you end back in the same place. They call that, right? That's the donut, right, Susan? I think that's correct. If you want to get public radio deep, tell them you want the donut. Sophie, should we wrap up here because we're getting close to the top?
Yeah, I think that was great. And you are welcome back in York anytime, I'm sure, to the library. Certainly, we'd love to see you in person if that ever happens.
Boy, that would be a thrill.
Thank all of you for your time this evening. It was really fascinating to hear, kind of the snippets and kind of hear them all in one place, because sometimes you lose them when they're all sort of separated, and it was wonderful to sort of see them all like this. So we truly appreciate your time, all of you. We've had great feedback in the chat. Hopefully you're seeing some of it. Some of it I know probably is coming to me directly, but everybody has really enjoyed this presentation. And I thank you so much for giving us your evenings tonight.
Thank you for having us. It's our pleasure, and we'd love to come and talk more.
All right.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you again.